Hello, Now Playing listeners. This is Arnie, and I'm here with another book review, this time looking at the short story, The Birds. Now, yes, I know there's two more Devil Wears Prada books to go. My review of the next one will be out next week. I've read both, I'm ready to go with those. But I wanted to preempt those and do a review of The Birds today, because today is the start of Now Playing Podcast's Platinum Donation Drive. We've been covering animal attacks all winter and spring with Anaconda, Lake Placid, and now we've reached the ultimate level where we're going to be reviewing the two Birds movies. There's the Hitchcock original and then a 90s made-for-Showtime sequel, The Birds 2. And then we're going to be reviewing another Tippi Hedren animal attack movie called Roar. And The Birds is perhaps one of Hitchcock's most well-known films. It's the film he did immediately after Psycho, so anticipation was very high to see what he did next. And the same way Psycho was based on a previously written story, in that case, Robert Bloch's 1959 novel that Stuart did do a book review of way back when we covered the Psycho films, The Birds was a 1952 short story by English author Daphne du Maurier. Hitch was familiar with Daphne's work and planned on adapting The Birds not to a movie, but as part of his Alfred Hitchcock Presents TV show. But he had looked at a film called Marnie to do next. It didn't work out. Stuart talks about that in our Birds movie review. He would end up making Marnie, but just not immediately. And so Hitch promoted this story from a TV episode to a full-blown, effects-driven film. So yes, you can hear all about Hitchcock's movie, The Birds, and the Marnie meltdown on our Birds movie review if you are a platinum-level donor. But I'm here to give the short story its due. Now, Daphne du Maurier was an English author of some note when this came out. She had a long family history in entertainment. She was the daughter of two stage actors, Sir Gerald du Maurier and his wife, actress Muriel. And while they did primarily do stage work, this was the early 1900s, Gerald, her father, did a few films, including Lord Camber's Ladies, directed by Hitchcock. And we're going to talk more about that in a moment. But du Maurier is also the granddaughter of French novelist Georges du Marnier, whose 19th century novel Trilby has been adapted into film many times. Usually, the movies are called Svengali, the last of which was made in 1983 with Jodie Foster and Peter O'Toole. And Daphne du Maurier was the grandniece of Cummins du Maurier, a newspaper writer who became an editor of a magazine called Bystander. So really, even though the term wasn't around in the early 1900s, Daphne du Maurier was a nepo baby, and she decided she wanted to be a writer like her grandfather and leveraged her relatives to make it happen. Her first earliest works were published in Great Uncle Cummins' Bystander magazine. But, like all nepo babies, you rise based on who you know, but you stay based upon your talent, and she did prove herself a capable writer. Her first novel, The Loving Spirit, came out in 1931, but it was in 1938 that she really broke big as the best-selling author of an award-winning novel, Rebecca. And, as with a lot of writers, as their books gain in popularity, they start getting movies made about them. And 3 movies on Daphne du Maurier's work would be directed by Alfred Hitchcock. So as I mentioned, Daphne's father Gerald worked on Lord Camber's Ladies, and he and Hitchcock got along famously. Apparently they caroused together, played practical jokes, and stayed friends after the film. And I think that's probably how Hitchcock ended up making the first film adaptation that Daphne du Maurier had. Her 1936 novel, Jamaica Inn, became Hitchcock's 1939 film of the same name. And then Hitchcock's next film would also be based on her work, that best-selling novel Rebecca. And Hitchcock got the rights to Jamaica Inn fairly cheap. He was a more independent English director, and he knew the author. But while he was making Jamaica Inn, he got to see an early version of her novel, Rebecca, and he wanted that to be his next film. But that book was so popular that Daphne du Maurier was getting hefty offers from Hollywood studios to make Rebecca. And Hitchcock could not match their bids. So he partnered with David O. Selznick, producer of Gone with the Wind, and it's specifically because he wanted to adapt Daphne du Maurier's book that Hitchcock came from England and became an American director. And a successful one. Selznick did put up the money needed to secure the rights to the book, and Hitchcock complained about Selznick meddling with the film during filming and editing, but the result was an Oscar statue. For Selznick, not for Hitchcock. Hitchcock never won a directing Oscar. Selznick, being the producer, gets the award for Best Picture, and he got him back to back with Gone with the Wind in '39 and Rebecca in 1940. And it's easy to see why Daphne du Maurier's work would be a good fit for Hitchcock. Her writing was full of suspense and intrigue, and it often had downbeat or ambiguous endings. So over the years in the 40s and 50s, she continued to publish fiction and nonfiction, including some short stories that were notably darker than her longer fiction. Which brings us to her short story, The Birds. It was first published in her 1952 short story collection, The Apple Tree, which the book is republished as The Birds and Other Stories after the movie came out, and I got it on Amazon for Kindle under that name. Du Maurier was inspired to write it when she saw a man in England plowing a field and got attacked by gulls. And as you'll hear if you listen to our Birds movie review, that's something that Stuart Brock and I find to be kind of an amusing concept, but she took that and made a very stark, serious story. And her story is very different from the Hitchcock movie. Hitchcock has said in interviews he read the story once in the 50s, and it was the idea of it that stuck with him, not the details. And when he saw headlines that birds attack had happened on the west coast of America, that's what reminded him of the story. And he had screenwriters read du Maurier's story and adapt it to film, but he did not. And the result is that the only similarity between du Maurier's short story and the movie is that it has people on a coast inexplicably attacked by birds. So if the story of The Birds by Daphne du Maurier is not the movie, what is her story about? Well, it's a really small story set in the southwest England countryside in an area called Cornwall on the Atlantic Ocean. And it's the tale of a single family in the middle of an earth-shattering event. So it reminded me as I was reading it in many ways of Stephen King short stories like The Mist or Night Surf, if you remember my review of that. It's kind of an early The Stand. Or Trucks, which became the movie Maximum Overdrive. These are all stories of people trying to survive while something bad happens on a global scale. These stories are the exact opposite of Independence Day, where we get to see a huge government response to danger. And while my mind went to King, both for the setting of the story, a small town, in du Maurier's case in England, in Stephen King's case in Maine, and even the writing style of the prose reminded me of King, but du Maurier is following a healthy tradition of this type of tale. And I'd say probably the most well-known landmark version of this is H.G. Wells' 1898 novel, War of the Worlds. Like The Birds, it's set in southern England, and like The Birds, it follows a narrator and his family trying to survive as a strange force, aliens in War of the Worlds, birds in the birds, attack the country. But it goes back even further than War of the Worlds. Mary Shelley did a story called The Last Man, which was a sci-fi novel focusing on a handful of people left alive after a global plague. And I think Mary Shelley's story could be seen as a direct ancestor of Richard Matheson's 1954 novel I Am Legend, which was adapted 3 times into movies that we covered a few years back, including Will Smith's film and Charlton Heston's The Omega Man. And I really feel like all of those works are a direct influence on du Maurier's Birds. Because The Birds is a story of a national, maybe even global emergency, crazy bird attacks, but we never leave our main character and the setting of Cornwall. Another influence on du Maurier, I think, was probably Edgar Allan Poe, because Poe was a master of unexplained terror, mounting psychological dread, ordinary settings that become hostile, characters trapped by forces they can't understand, and his writing prioritized atmosphere over lore. And all of that is the case with The Birds. Much like Hitch's movie, we never find out in du Maurier's story why birds are attacking. The story being told from the point of view of a single man in England really drives up the psychological dread. His everyday countryside life becomes hostile when the birds come, and the characters get trapped in their house and they don't understand why. I think that's The Birds in a nutshell. And our point of view character in the short story is World War II veteran Nat Hoken. He works as a maintenance man on a nearby farm owned by a guy named Mr. Trigg. And Nat is hardworking and very skilled. He has a wife and two school-aged children. And one day in December, he notices a lot of gulls are acting strangely and chalks it up to the weather changing, because that night it gets really cold and he hears birds at his window. He goes to check it out and a bunch of birds fly in and peck his face. He runs to his children's room and they're being attacked by birds of all types, finches, robins, small birds not prone to violence. He gets his kids out and kills a bunch of birds with his bare hands, and in the morning, the attack ends. Nat knows something is amiss, and he goes, even though it's his day off, to talk to his boss, Mr. Trigg, and other neighbors, and everybody laughs him off. They just don't believe his story. But Nat becomes something of a doomsday prepper, boarding up his house while others around him continue to shrug it off. Even when the BBC reports on the radio that birds are massing and attacking all over Britain, only Nat seems to take it seriously. And these birds are no bird brains. They seem well organized. Like the smart sharks of deep blue sea, these birds are organized. Nat notices that the gulls gather over the sea and attack the coast, while other, more long-range birds fly right over Cornwall, going to attack London and the rest of the mainland. And in military style, the birds have different attacks based upon their strengths. Some birds claw and peck. Some heavier birds go kamikaze and just do suicide dives into buildings to break windows and boards so other birds can gain entry. And so while reading this story, I was thinking a lot about World War II. Of course, if you have kamikaze pilots, I can't help but think of World War II Japanese pilots. And du Maurier puts in the prose that Nat fought in World War II, so that's right at the fore, clearly an allegory going on. And growing up, my mother had a friend who lived in the South England countryside, and she would tell me a lot of stories about her growing up during World War II. She was a young girl, but she very much remembered seeing aircraft overhead, sometimes German bombers crossing England, but they would always cheer when they'd see RAF planes or sometimes American aircraft flying to defend against the Germans. During the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, this air cover was especially heavy. And here, Nat sees the birds going overhead like German planes going to attack the mainland. And, like in the war, the English do try to fight back against the birds by sending planes, but birds get in the motors and the planes all crash. And this isn't told from the point of view of the pilots. We never leave Nat's point of view. It's a strong third-person story, but Nat hears the sounds outside and surmises what's going on. Another thing my mother's friend told me about were the English blackout drills, where there were actions to board up their houses and go totally dark, and the warning siren went off to avoid being a target for flying enemies. And I'm thinking about that as Nat is boarding up his house. And at one point, Nat's wife even asks, will the Americans come and save them? And I know that a lot of English people, like my mother's friend, do see America as their saviors during World War II. So I really think we are seeing a story where post-war trauma is being relived, but this time instead of Germans, it's birds. Which could be very silly. As I said, we kind of laugh about that on our show with the movie review, but it's about the skill of the storyteller to make that not sound dumb. And du Maurier is really good at keeping the tension high. Nat realizes the birds come and go with the tide, and that gives him an insight into when the attacks are going to come and just how long he has to prepare for each one. Trying to board up the house, Nat knows the family doesn't have enough supplies, such as candles, food, and oil, so the need to restock becomes a tense clock-watching mission out to Mr. Tig's farm. Nat also tries to keep his own children reassured, even though he's not sure himself of what the outcome's going to be. So with this, du Maurier writes several suspenseful sequences where Nat is fighting against the clock before the birds come back to prepare for the next round of assault. And things get more bleak. The BBC goes off the air, indicating perhaps the fall of the government, and Nat and his family are left on their own when the birds kill their neighbors. And my favorite part about this story, spoiler alert, is that, like Hitchcock's movie, it ends on a really dour note. Nat and his family have survived, but the birds are still mobilizing and attacking. How long can Nat stay in his home? How many boards can continue to reinforce the windows and doors? The nihilistic ending reminds me of other great stories. I think often of George Romero's original Night of the Living Dead, or Stephen King's story, The Mist. Not that awful tacked-on Frank Darabont, the military's coming ending, but the real ending where the father and son go out into the mist and we never know what happens. So no, I really enjoyed du Maurier's story here. I started reading it as an obligation to the movie review. A little bit of homework so I could see the source material before watching the film. I'd never seen it before. But the writing style and the story sucked me in by page 5, and it's a very short story. I think it was only about 22 pages on my Kindle on my phone. So what started as obligatory reading became a page-turner for me. I really was engrossed in seeing how the story ended, and when it did end, it left me with a long impression because of that nihilism, but I was also sad that the story was done. I really liked du Maurier's prose. It felt really modern. And I know this was only written in the 1950s, so it's not like I'm reading Mary Shelley or Charles Dickens, but still, that's 80 years old, and the prose feels like it could have been a period piece that was written very recently. So if you have any interest, maybe if you like Hitchcock's film The Birds and you've never read this story, I give it a strong recommend. It's free to read on Kindle Unlimited under the title The Birds and Other Stories, or just $7 to buy digitally, and you get other du Maurier short stories with that I have not read yet. But I think it will be a totally different experience from Hitchcock's film The Birds. And while I recommend the story, do I recommend the movie? Well, you can find out all of the details about that if you make a platinum donation to Now Playing Podcast. If you do, you'll get to hear all of our Animal Attack movie reviews, Alligator and Alligator 2, Lake Placid, all of those, the 5 Anaconda films, 6 if you count when Anaconda goes to Lake Placid, and then yes, for the next 2 weeks, The Birds, and then finally, Tippi Hedren's film, Roar. So thank you for listening to this book review, thank you for supporting Now Playing, and I'll be back next week with the second Devil Wears Prada book review, Revenge Wears Prada, The Devil Returns. Talk to you then.
This has been a Venganza Media production. Copyright 2026. All rights reserved.